life on Earth was very different from the life on Earth today. There was much space on the land, few people to occupy that space, and we remembered. We remembered the true nature, the compassion of our lives. We remembered the gift of this world and the beauty within this world, the gift that we've come to call life. And then something began to happen. Our lives changed as the memory of that gift began to fade. Feeling separate from the very world that we had come to experience, we began to build machines, extensions of ourselves, external technology, to explore that world and once again remember. Deep into the quantum world of the sub-atom we have traveled. Deep into the furthest reaches of interstellar space, we probe, sending machines, surrogates of our perceptions, to explore. And now a mystery unfolds as our own science seeks the memory of ourselves, moving into the farthest reaches of space, plunging deep into the quantum world of the atom. We find that there is a force. There's a force that eludes explanation. Scientists see this as a field that cannot be measured, a field that defies engineering. They call this an intelligence. That force, that field, that intelligence that binds all in its creation, the ancients called spirit. All of the data, all of the measurements, all of the information point back to you and I, asking us to remember, asking us to once again know the mystery within. Collectively, as we approach this time in history that the ancients called the shift of the ages, our own science is directing us back to ourselves, back to the very nature of our being, back to what is very possibly the single most sophisticated technology ever to have graced this world with its presence. It's the mystery of you and I, the mystery of life. Through this mysterious force, expressing as our lives, once again we will know ourselves, and in that knowing, once again, you and I will remember. As I began putting this presentation together, it was so clear to me through my life experience and my life path that compassion would play such a key role in the unfolding of this information. Through my life experience, 2 near-death experiences in 1959, leading to a series of synchronistic experiences, sacred journeys all over the world, culminating in Mount Sinai in 1986, in early 1987. Compassion became to me the key to the graceful transition that we are asking ourselves to allow as we live these days of the shift of the ages. The ancients called the shift of the ages. In looking for an image that to me conveys the feeling of compassion, I came across this image, the image of Archangel Michael, from an artist, a very good friend of mine, Cheryl Yambach-Rose. She lives in the Mount Shasta area. She created this image the evening that the United States began bombing in the Gulf War. She went to bed that evening after turning off the television and seeing that we had, in fact, begun the bombing. And this vision came to Cheryl. It's a vision of Archangel Michael enveloping the earth in the power of his presence. And as you can see, he is in prayer over a very specific portion of the earth. This is over the Middle East, where the conflict was occurring. And the entire earth is suspended over this cup, the chalice cup of Christ, the cup of transformation. And Cheryl had a prayer that came with a vision that evening, and to me, her prayer embodies the science of compassion. Her prayer was this: that no one would ever win this conflict, that no one would win this war, that there were no rights and no wrongs, that somehow the entire experience would be transformed into something greater in its outcome than it was in the components of its beginning. Well, you and I know that the history books will show that the United States won the war in the Gulf, and it remains to be seen, I believe, as to whether or not anything was really won or not. I will use this image often to convey to you, for me, the epitome of the science of compassion. the recognizing of the nature of the conflict and the allowing of the experience. Within our modern culture, the 20th century idiom, our scientists are seeing events, unprecedented events, events that we have no reference points for at all, unfold before our eyes. We're seeing them on our Earth. We're seeing them far out beyond our Earth into interstellar space that surrounds our Earth. For example, in 1991, this is an image of the Milky Way galaxy, a spiral galaxy that we live in. Because we live within the Milky Way, we can actually photograph the actual Milky Way. This is a simulation of a similar galaxy. In the center of our Milky Way, the great central sun, as the ancients called it, there is a mysterious radiant source of information. Well, in 1991, scientists began to notice a new frequency, a new wavelength, a new band of light radiating, triggering from the center of this Milky Way, bathing the stars and the suns and the planets in a new light that had never been experienced before. What does this light mean? Why did it happen, and why is it happening now? As we look into our solar system, and you don't have to look very far, really, to see that our scientists and our researchers are spending a tremendous amount of time and money exploring throughout our solar system with the probes, the Magellan probe that mapped over 90% of the surface of Venus. The Ulysses probe, we'll speak about in just a minute, that is exploring the surface of the sun. The probe's Voyager that has traveled far beyond the edges, the outer reaches of our solar system. All these probes, the Viking probes in 1976, went to find life on Mars, biological life, never expecting to find archaeological evidence over 500,000 years old. Well, this information, this kind of information, our scientists have access to this information. There appears to be a discontinuity, a lack of continuity between the events as they see them unfold. Researchers believe that as they are witnessing these phenomena, that they are discrete, non-related phenomena. Let's go into some of these. Let's look at some of this phenomenon as we delve into this information. And begin with the sun. Our sun, the radiant ball of light that we call our sun, is undergoing a tremendous change that began in the mid to late 1980s. What we began to see was an increased number of solar flares, solar prominences, tremendous X-ray bursts, solar flares that traveled across 93 million miles of space and actually lapped against the atmosphere of the Earth, interrupting our magnetic fields and playing havoc with our, wreaking havoc with our weather patterns. Well, in 1994, our scientists, American scientists, built a craft, the Ulysses probe. And we sent that craft to the sun to investigate further, to see what's really happening here on the sun. The first thing that they did was they traveled to the south pole of the sun to measure the magnetic fields. Now, we've measured these magnetic fields from the Earth in the past, and we've always believed that the sun, in fact, has a polarity in the magnetic field. And what we discovered in late December of 1994 was that as the Ulysses craft began measuring the polarity of the south pole of the sun, the readings were much lower than had been expected. The scientists said, well, that's interesting. Let's go to the equator and see what's happening at the equator. And it took a few more months, and by May of 1995, the Ulysses craft was at the equator of the sun, and again took readings, and to the surprise of our researchers, they discovered that the readings were very low and very similar to the readings that they had taken at the South Pole. So they said, well, let's go to the North Pole and see what's happening. So the Ulysses craft then traveled to the North Pole, we consider to be the North Pole of the sun, and what they discovered was this, that the readings from the North Pole, the South Pole, and the equator were very, very similar. There was not much differentiation between North and South Pole. And what scientists are actually saying now is that the sun has lost its polarity. The sun has lost the magnetic fields, the polarity of those magnetic fields, and has moved to what is called a steady state magnetic field. And that field is decreasing rapidly. Now, that will be important in just a moment. So I'll ask you to remember, to hold this thought, that the sun is losing magnetics losing its intensity of magnetics very quickly. And we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Jupiter, oh, a beautiful planet. I love to see these images, these computer-enhanced images taken from several different craft. The storm, this red eye that we see on Jupiter, this storm, apparently unlike any storm we've ever seen on Earth, because this storm was first recorded over 3,000 years ago by Chinese astronomers. And it has been continuously raging in the atmosphere of Jupiter for approximately 3,000 years. Well, as you can see, this storm, the giant red eye in this storm, has a rotational component. You can see that there's a feel of a rotation on that component, or a rotational component on this storm. For over 3,000 years, astronomers have seen that rotation in a very specific direction. Something interesting happened in 1986, 1987, synchronistically perhaps, just about the same time that the sun began going through its changes with the increase in the solar flares and the X-ray bursts. This giant storm began to rotate in the opposite direction and continues to do so today. What would cause a rotation, a shift in an atmospheric phenomenon that has been constant for at least 3,000 years? What would cause that? Well, again, in 1994, not long after the Ulysses craft measured the magnetic fields of the sun, you and I witnessed an outrageous phenomenon by any standards on the giant of Jupiter, as we saw through our live cameras a single fragment of something. And right now, we're not even sure what that something was. Some people believe it may have been a comet. Some believe it may have been an asteroid of some kind. A single body moving quickly toward this giant. And within a few days of impact, that single fragment breaking into 21 separate fragments. And those 21 fragments impacting the surface, the gaseous atmosphere and the surface of the Jovian atmosphere. We saw that. We witnessed this rare event live in real time. Scientists speculated that this phenomenon would affect Earth in several ways. They speculated that, first of all, that the water vapor in Earth's atmosphere would be affected, and that it would rearrange that water vapor, shifting the weather patterns on the Earth. And that's precisely what happened. We've seen that. We're still seeing the effects from that. Scientists also speculated that the magnetic fields of the Earth may, in fact, be impacted by the shock waves. Every time one of these fragments struck the Jovian atmosphere, a shock wave traveled across interstellar space, essentially striking Earth each time one of these fragments struck Jupiter. 21 fragments struck Jupiter. Earth was hit 21 times by 21 wave fronts within rapid succession. The magnetic fields of the Earth were indeed impacted. And you'll see in just a few minutes why that's important, why you care, what these phenomena mean to you, to your emotional state of being, to your feeling world, to the relationships, the interpersonal relationships, to the genetic makeup of your being. As this similar as this information may appear, the reality is that all the phenomena that we are speaking of now are directly related and in support of a process. And is a process that you are living in your world, in your lives, in your bodies in this moment. And all of these phenomena, I believe, are byproducts of a much greater phenomenon that is occurring within here. That's where we'll be going with this for the next couple of hours. The shock waves in Jupiter. This is a computer-enhanced image of one of the shock waves from the point of impact, and you can see the wave radiating out through the Jovian atmosphere, through the gases of the atmosphere, and then on into, across space, into the proximity of the Earth. The planets in the outer reaches of our solar system, there is a phenomenon, there's a mystery that's unfolding with our Earth scientists right now. In the past, up until the present time, we have always believed that the planets in our solar system were heated through the radiant heating process of our sun, our local star, radiating heat through tremendous expanses, vast expanses of space. Well, there's an interesting phenomenon that's happening now in that our sun is cooling It's actually cooling down, another part of the phenomenon that the Ulysses craft is investigating. And while the sun is cooling, the planets, and especially the planets in the outer reaches of our solar system, are heating up. There is a heat that is coming from an internal source that is not well understood in the past. In these planets, the mystery is, where's that heat coming from? Why are these planets heating up now? If it's not coming from the radiant heat of the sun, what is generating the heat within these planets? Well, to understand really what all of this information is all about, we may study out there. We can look out into the outer reaches of interstellar space, and we are finding information that is useful to us. Right in our own Earth, is where we're really beginning to understand the meaning of what phenomenon mean. And I'll be very clear about this right now. For me, understanding the meaning of the events as they're unfolding in our lives provides a context. And it is within that context that you and I will move very quickly beyond the charts and the graphs and the magnetics and the frequencies and all the things, all the technical things that we're speaking now. We'll move beyond that into the very real, the very feeling, the very emotional world of our day-to-day lives and our relationships, and why those patterns, why the patterns of relationship are shifting so quickly right now, and what that means to the genetic makeup of our bodies as we approach this time that the ancients called the shift of the ages. So this is where we're going with this information. We're providing a context within which everything that we will do for the rest of the afternoon will hang as within the framework of this context. As we look at the Earth, we are seeing unprecedented phenomena unfolding throughout the systems of energy that allow Earth to be Earth. Social systems, political systems, economic systems, geological systems, meteorological systems, agricultural systems. As different as they all seem, they are simply patterns of energy, patterns of information that are bound together, held in place through common threads of vibratory experience. And those threads are shifting. As they do, Earth shifts in response to those threads. Now this is a map, a portion of a map of the tectonic makeup of the surface of the Earth. The tectonic plates that move and slip over the inner portions of the Earth, allowing Earth the expression of crustal features. And what you're seeing, if you were able to see this clearly on your screen, you would see along each of these plate boundaries a series of red dots. Each one of those dots represents a seismic event. And what we're seeing is that we have an unprecedented number of seismic events, earthquake activity, occurring globally in our world right now. Some you hear about if it's local, if it's in North America. Recently, within the last year and a half, we have had earthquakes throughout the Midwest, Indiana, Missouri, Kentucky, in the Northeast and upstate New York. Something interesting is happening in California. When I had the opportunity to work as a geologist for Phillips Petroleum in the, well, it was in the mid to late 1970s, there was a number, a telephone number, a hotline that you could call for the United States Geologic Survey. And on that hotline, daily, they would report the numbers of seismic events occurring in different parts of the country. So in California, for example, they would say level 1 on the Richter scale, we had 5 seismic events. Level 2, we had 3, or whatever it was. Well, recently, USGS has had to stop that service for level 1, level 2, and level 3 events because there are so many of them they cannot discern where one ends and another begins. It sounds to the researchers, it sounds like one continuous rumble under the surface of the Earth with not much break in between. That's the good news. What that means is that the crustal pressures are being relieved gradually as we would choose for them to be without much notice. We've never seen this happen before. Other parts of the world, in Japan in 1994, there was an event, a phenomenon. Through geologic standards, it's outrageous. If you weren't following the tech journals, you probably did not see much of this piece of information. In late 1994, there were a series of earthquakes in southern Japan, which is not unusual in and of itself. What was unusual was the number and the severity. Instead of having 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 30 or 40 or 60, there were over 70 consecutive sequential seismic events that happened in Japan in December of 1994, and they were non-related. It wasn't like one was triggering another, was triggering another, was triggering another. They were independent, non-related events. We saw something very similar in Southern California not long ago, actually on my birthday, on June 28th, in Southern California, when 2 independent, simultaneous earthquakes were triggered at precisely the same time. Up until that time, researchers had never seen a phenomenon like that before. It had always been one triggering another. 2 of them happening at the same time within just a short distance of one another. So we're seeing unprecedented numbers and degrees of seismic activity all over the world. Bolivia in 1994. I was in Peru with a group. We had were completing a sacred journey through Lake Titicaca. And we were actually on the water in the lake when just across the Bolivian border there was an earthquake with an epicenter 400 miles beneath the surface of our planet. 400 miles. We didn't feel that earthquake, and we were just a few miles away in the water. Where they felt that earthquake was in North America, in Toronto and in Denver, Toronto, Canada, and Denver, Colorado. And researchers said, why? Why didn't the people in Peru feel that earthquake? And the reason is, and what they now know, is that that earthquake was showing us something about the interior of our Earth that was very different from what we had believed in the past was the true nature of the interior of our Earth. Even if you're not aware of any of the other events we're speaking about, you do not have to look very far to see nearly every major publication within the last few years has either developed a special issue or devoted a large portion of a regular issue to unusual phenomenon. Time magazine did a beautiful expose on the vanishing of the ozone layers. What this article is actually saying, it was in part a research project through NASA. What they discovered was that the ozone was disappearing much more rapidly than they had ever suspected. And even before the research was finished, Time went to press with this article, a fascinating article, and I'll share some perspectives with you on why this may not be such a bad thing that's happening. It's a little bit different viewpoint of what's happening with here with the ozone. Scientific American, Science News, all of them are talking to science and the tech journals about global patterns of weather changing. Some of them say that we're warming up, the greenhouse effect. Some say that we're cooling down, moving into a new ice age. Which is it, one or the other? The new diseases, the new viruses. Why is it now, within the last few years, just before the close of this grand cycle of experience, why is it that we're seeing unprecedented numbers of viruses? HIV, for example, we had the HIV virus. Our bodies didn't know what to do with. And now we have HIV-1 look-alike, HIV-2 look-alike, HIV-3, 4, 5 look-alike. The hantavirus, first found in the Four Corners area of northern New Mexico. Old viruses that we believed were cured, such as polio, now coming back with a vengeance. The antibiotics and the materials that we developed, the chemicals that we developed, we believe to cure these viruses, the viruses like them now. They're coming back and they're coming back with a vengeance. Why is this happening? Why is it happening now? What does it mean to you? What does it have to do with everything else that we're talking about here? Planets heating up in our solar system, unprecedented numbers of earthquakes in our planet. Well, in addition to those phenomenon, we have some even more beautiful phenomenon, I believe, and pretty outrageous at the same time. Phenomenon to look at, crop circles. Crop circles first appeared in numbers, in large numbers, mid-1970s, 75, 76, right around in there. And for those of you that may not be familiar with the crop circles, I'll review them just briefly. They were simply circles, patterns, in cereal grain crops in nearly every crop-producing country in the world, where the stalks of grain in an authentic crop circle, where they are gently bent at a 51-degree angle. They are still alive, they still produce their fruit, they may still be harvested if they're done early enough in their season. Researchers have discovered that samples of grains taken from within the crop circles are very different from the control samples that are taken outside of the circle. For example, the crystalline structure is different within the circle than it is from outside the circle. Seeds that are grown from within samples taken from within this crop circle germinate very quickly. They bud very quickly, and they produce more berries per unit than those taken from outside of the circle. There certainly are crop circles and glyphs that are hoaxed, and they do not produce the same phenomenon. They are not gently bent at a 51-degree angle. The stalks are actually broken on those. So in the mid-1970s, we began to see an increasing number of, at first they were circles, and the researchers were quick to say they're either hoaxed or they're natural phenomenon. They're just wind whipping these crops into vortices. Well, we began to see things like this. And I put this slide in here so that you could see the detail, the interwoven nature of the stalks. It's pretty difficult to hoax something like this, and especially over glyphs that are 200 and 300 yards in diameter. An interesting side note, in 1994, for the first time, we've never found any animals that were caught up within any of these crop circles, probably because most animals, when they hear or sense whatever it is that's creating these circles, the animals run. Well, there is one particular animal that does just the opposite of that, and that is a porcupine. Porcupines, when they sense danger, they simply curl up into a ball and stay put until the danger has passed. Well, in 1994, for the first time in Canada, there were 2 porcupines whose quills were actually woven into the structure of the crop circle as it was unfolding. They were no longer living. They were very flat at that point, and their quills were very easily woven into the structure of this crop circle. To the best of my knowledge, that's the first time that's happened. So we see these complex patterns that are very difficult to hoax. Well, the simple circles began to become more and more complex. Each year, the number of circles would increase through the early 1990s, and each year there would be what was called a grand finale, the greatest, most complex, most beautiful crop circle of all. This particular image here is from 1993, I believe, and this is considered to be the grand finale of 1993. Well, the researchers that were saying we had a natural phenomenon of wind whipping these crops into vortices looked at this and they said, well, this is pretty complex. It looks very intentional. Maybe there's something else happening. In 1994, I had the opportunity to attend and present a body of information at a crop circle conference in England. And while we were there, crop circles were appearing at the rate of about 11 per day all around the area where we were at. The next slide that I'll show you is what I consider to be the grand finale of 1994. A beautiful image of a very powerful pattern in the science of sacred geometry. If you're familiar with sacred geometry, you know that this is called the seed of life, and it is an integral component of a greater pattern called the flower of life. If you are not familiar with sacred geometry, you simply know by looking at this, you sense, you feel that there's something important happening here. This is a very powerful resonant symbol that we have. Well, 1995 crop season has just completed. We just got the slides back. I haven't really shown them to many people. And the next image that I have is, for me, one of the most interesting in 1995. And what you're seeing here, many researchers believe that we're seeing a model of our solar system. Here's the sun in the center. And just beyond the sun, you see Mercury in the orbit of Mercury, Venus in the orbit of Venus, the orbit of Earth, and there's no Earth in this orbit. And then Mars in the orbit of Mars, and the asteroid belt in its orbit, and we're not seeing anything beyond that. To many researchers, they believe that this is saying something very similar to what many of the crop circle messages have said, and that's simply that there is a change unfolding upon the earth, within the lives of the people upon the earth. I do not necessarily believe that this means Earth is disappearing. I believe that Earth, as we have always known Earth, is going through a tremendous transition and will probably never look the same following the transition as it did before that. And not intending to suggest here in this slide that there will be no Earth at all. Simply not the same Earth as we've seen before. Well, we're seeing these glyphs appear in many places, and some actually very unexpected places. The next slide that I'll show you is a slide that came to us from a little town known as Shaughnessy. And in Shaughnessy, what we see is the caption on the picture here. It says, they'd been seen before in Shaughnessy, but Doreen was still unprepared for the eerie rug circles that she was seeing in her living room. So maybe they are appearing in some other places. I don't know. Of course, this is ridiculous. And it's not that far from a phenomenon that is actually happening right now. I have not seen crop circles in people's carpets. I have seen actual photographs of glyphs that are appearing in places where there are no crops, and they use whatever media is there. In the ice, frozen rivers, lakes, and streams throughout the winter months in the Northwest, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and all through the American Desert Southwest. We're seeing those. The glyphs are not etched into the top of the ice or into the bottom. They're actually embedded in the inner layers of the ice, and they don't really last long. And even beyond that, for the first time this last year, 1995, I saw a phenomenon in northern New Mexico on a sandbar in the Rio Grande River. This image that I'm going to show you was taken from a balloonist who was at about 2,300 feet above the surface of the Earth. He lost air in his balloon quickly and dropped to about 200 feet. He believed that he was going to crash. And at 200 feet, he looked down onto this sandbar, and it happened to be on the day of the solstice, very close to high noon. And what he saw is this. You can see this spiral. This is a very, very particular, very specific kind of spiral that you will see often in the petroglyphs of the Southwest, in the traditions of the Hopi, the Navajo, many of the other indigenous people of that time. The spiral of time, the spiral of life. And the interesting thing about this and this particular spiral is that it didn't last long. It was gone within just a few hours of this sandbar. The water receded, the glyph was exposed, and then the glyph disappeared and the water covered it up again. So we're seeing a phenomenon that, if it is not new, has not been recorded much over the last few hundred years. All these things are happening now within the last few years of the close of this cycle, the close of this decade, this grand cycle of experience that began nearly 200,000 years ago. Why? What does it mean? What does it mean to you and I? Again, the continuity of the information and the context within which this information is offered are so important. One additional phenomenon that I'd like to speak about as we're moving into this information is something called the photon belt. There's a lot of information, a lot of books out now, and people are talking about the photon belt, what it means to us, what it means to our lives as we're witnessing this this phenomenon for which we have no reference point. We've never seen this happen before. Essentially what the photon belt is, in 1961, an astronomer named Robert Stanley began to detect particles of light, increased numbers of these particles in the atmosphere of the Earth. They were called photons. And they've been measured since 1961, and they have continued to increase in density. So what's happening is we are moving into a band, if you will, of greater and greater density, greater and greater particles of light. Well, researchers now know that this band is a band that our solar system runs into, or actually passes through, once about every 26 to 27,000 years, somewhere right around in there, depending on which calendars we're looking at. And that it takes our solar system about 2,000 years for us to pass from one edge to the other of this band. And at the 1,000 year point, we are in the center of the band, the densest portion of the light that this band, that this photon belt has to offer. Now there are texts out there from their perspective that have offered a scenario that to some people appears frightening. And there has been some concern about what it means to us, what it means to our lives as we pass into this photon belt. We're in the photon belt right now. And you're watching this video, I'm able to record this video, our material, our equipment is still functioning, and we're in this photon belt. What I believe is happening is that the interpretation of our time when we actually reach the midpoint of the photon belt, that time coincides very closely with a point in history that the ancients called the shift of the ages. And as we go through our magnetic models and the models of base resonant frequency of the Earth, you will see what those parameters mean to our lives, and you'll see how those parameters timed synchronistically with the moving into the center of the photon belt, how they provide a very different and unique experience for us. I believe that this is a very healthy and a very natural process that we are moving into, is a process not to be feared, to be welcomed, as this photon belt is offering to you and I a reference signal, a reference frequency of light. And that will make more sense, and we'll refer back to this as we move through this body of information. The ancient calendars, almost universally, the ancient calendars point to this decade, to this time in history, as being unique not only in human history, as we have known it for the last 200,000 years or so, to Earth history, to geologic history as well. Almost universally, the calendars, Chinese calendars, Tibetan calendars, the Mayan calendars, the Egyptian calendars, that were developed thousands of years ago end in these days. They end in this time, and they all point to now as being a time that is very unique in history. This is an image of, it's taken from the wall of the Temple of Dendara in Egypt. And I know from where you are, it may not be clear what this image is. I'll give you a schematic next. I'll show you a schematic drawing so you can actually see what we're looking at. This is the original zodiac calendar from this temple wall. This is where the original patterns of the zodiac come from. This calendar, this Egyptian calendar, began nearly 39,000 years ago. Now, 39,000 years ago, this calendar was developed, and it ends now, in these days. The Mayan calendar, by some estimates over 18,000 years old, points to now, to this time in history. Jose Arguelles, in his book, The Mayan Factor, suspected that that Mayan calendar measures something much more than time, in addition to the passing of linear time. What the Mayan calendar says is that time, as you and I have always known it, actually ended in July of 1992. And between July of 1992 and December of the year 2012, you and I are experiencing the interface, a transition point between two kinds of time as they are defined by the light received upon the Earth, tying back to the photon belt. During that time, the Mayans were so specific about this period in time that they even had a name for this time. They called it no time. And they said those who would live this interface period between the time that's always been and the time that is yet to be, those who would live this time would be living the time of no time. And that it would take a very, very powerful being, a very special being, a being capable of remembering and focusing and holding the focus of the nature and the intent of their life purpose to live during this transition time. So the Mayan calendar, 18,000 years old, points to these days, to this time in history. Why are these calendars all pointing to now? What is the trigger that is allowing this shift, allowing a change of some kind to happen according to these calendars as we know them now? Well, to really understand what this process is all about, all of the phenomenon, all of the unprecedented and outrageous things that we're seeing happen for which there are no reference points, to really understand the continuity and the related nature of these events. I believe that it is key to begin to view the earth through the eyes both of the ancient traditions and the language of our modern science. It's the marriage, the union of those traditions that allow us the understanding and the wisdom to move forward through this unprecedented time in history. So as we go to the earth, just for a few moments, this will look like maybe like Science 101, just for a couple of moments. I'll ask you to consider this. You may have done this experiment at some point when you were in school. If you didn't, you can do it at home on your own. You can go to any hardware store, take a bar of iron, and wrap a conductor around that iron, copper wire, a certain direction, and pass electricity through that wire in one direction. And what will happen is the iron bar develops a phenomenon known as polarity. It has a north and a south pole. Okay? When the electricity is shut off, the polarity goes away. It is the flow of electrons, now this is important, the flow of electrons in a circular fashion around the iron that produces the fields of the magnetics. Okay? Now if you take that same iron bar with the same configuration and pass electricity in the opposite direction. Okay, so we're just passing electricity in the opposite direction. Electrons moving in a circular fashion around the iron in the opposite direction. We still have a north and a south pole. Look what's happened. The poles have reversed. What was once north becomes south, and what was once south becomes north. That concept is a beautiful metaphor for precisely what is happening on Earth in our world right now. Until recently, when we looked at a cross-section of the Earth, we believed that the Earth looked very similar to what you're seeing here. This is a cutaway diagram that was made back in the early 1990s, and we're seeing the crust as the blue portion, the thin layer of the crust on the Earth, the thicker mantle, and the yellow and the red, the outer and the inner cores of the Earth. Within just the last few months, what we've discovered is that even this image now is obsolete, as we've discovered that the center core of our Earth is not a sphere at all, that it is crystalline in nature, following the form of a platonic solid, an ancient form that we know as the dodecahedron. It is approximately 98% iron. So if you'll think back to the little demonstration that we did just a few moments ago of the copper wire wrapped around the iron bar, electrons passing through that wire in a circular fashion around the iron generate the magnetic fields. Well, when I was studying geology to become a geologist back in late 1970s, one of the big mysteries was, where do these magnetic fields come from on the Earth? We knew they were there. Where did they come from? What the ancient texts have told us, and what we now know, have been able to demonstrate, is that these magnetic fields result from the same metaphor as the electrons passing around the copper wire and the iron bar. Earth rotates. If you look at a model of the Earth, here's our Earth. Earth rotates about an axis. Okay, and in that rotation, what is happening is, to be very clear about the mechanism, is that the overall rotation is occurring, and within that, the mantle inside the Earth rotates at a different speed, and the outer crust rotates at a different speed, and the inner crust, the inner core rotates at a different speed, and they are all rotating simultaneously at varying rates. In that rotation, what you have is essentially electrons moving around iron, the iron cores of the Earth. And it is this rotation of the Earth that generates the very powerful magnetic fields that we're discussing now. So, the magnetic fields of the Earth are generated from the rotation of the Earth. There is something very interesting that is happening with the magnetic fields of the Earth right now. Researchers have known for years that the faster the Earth rotates, the stronger the fields, and the slower the Earth rotates, the weaker the fields of the magnetics are. Okay, now that's important. Look at this. In this image, what you're seeing here, this red line is a line of the magnetic fields of the Earth through time. Time is passing in this direction. Right here, this is the present time today. Now we're looking 2,000 years ago. And what we see is that 2,000 years ago, the magnetic fields were at a peak. They were higher 2,000 years ago than they had been for a long, long time. And they were higher 2,000 years ago than they have been at any time since then. And what we can say is this. We can say that 2,000 years ago, Earth had the strongest, the densest magnetic fields. Earth was rotating faster 2,000 years ago, generating those strong magnetic fields. And then something began to happen. As you can see, the magnetic fields are dropping. Well, if the strength of those fields is tied to the rotation of the Earth, and the faster Earth rotates, the stronger the fields are, when you see low fields, what you are seeing is a decrease in the rotation of the Earth. And that's precisely what is happening. Earth right now is slowing down. It rotates slower and slower each year. Our researchers know this. Researchers know this. They measure this, the National Bureau of Standards in Boulder, Colorado. Every year, they must adjust the atomic clocks, the cesium-based clocks that keep track of our time. They have to adjust those clocks to compensate for the slowing of Earth's rotation. Now, admittedly, it's not very much that they have to do the adjustments. They're very, very small, incremental periods of time, and those periods of incremental time are cumulative. They add up over long periods of time. And the researchers actually say, they say that if we did not do that, by the end of this decade, what used to be noon would become midnight. That's how much of a change the rotation has, the effect that it has on our keeping of time. Well, if we're seeing this magnetic field decrease, what we're seeing is the slowing of the rotation of the Earth. So on our little board over here, I have you see this red line represents the intensity of the magnetic fields of the Earth as time increases in this direction. Okay, so here's the magnetic fields on this scale here. Here is no magnetics, a 0-point magnetic, and we're somewhere around in here. We're losing, excuse me, we're losing magnetics very, very quickly. The interesting thing is that it is not a linear drop. Researchers can't look at where the magnetics were 50 years ago and then look at where they are 5 years ago and draw a straight line and say that's where they're going to be 5 years from now. It is not a linear function. It is a geometric function. I hope that's an erasable pen that we have on here. It's a geometric drop that we're seeing on these magnetic fields. So you say, well, how much are these fields actually dropping? Right now, we're experiencing about 50% less magnetics on our planet than we did only 1,500 years ago. 50% less. And it appears that we're losing around 5 to 6, maybe 8% of the magnetic field every 100 years up until fairly recently, and now we're losing even more. It's happening quicker. So what we can say is the more that the fields drop, the faster they drop. Through mutual friends, I had the opportunity to talk about this information with someone from the GeoMonitor organization. They keep track of things like this kind of information, magnetics, frequency, and such. And they said, yes, in fact, the Earth's magnetics are dropping very quickly. And they said two very interesting things that I'll share with you now. First thing they said was that any time in recorded history that Earth's magnetics have dropped to this degree, it has always been a precursor to a 180-degree polar reversal, to the North Pole becoming the South and the South Pole becoming North. You'll see the mechanism for that in just a moment. And the second thing that they said I think is really interesting. What they said is this. When someone asked them how low the magnetics of Earth are actually right now, what the GeoMonitor people said was this. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest readings, the strongest magnetics, right now, early 1996, Earth is between a 1 and a 1.5 on this scale. That is how low the fields are in a relative sense, and they're continuing to drop. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is not new. Earth's dropping of the magnetic fields is not a new phenomenon. I have a drawing here. It's a text page right out of a textbook, so it's a little difficult to see. And what I'll point out to you is this. This is a time scale. Present time is at the top. Ancient time is at the bottom. This scale represents 4.5 million years. 4.5 million years. And what we're seeing here, the two columns that I'll call your attention to, is this column right here, of these little boxes, and then right next to it, this column right here. And what these columns represent, each of these blocks represents a period of geologic time when Earth was oriented either north-south, the way we know it now, or north-south reversed. So for example, this block right here represents a long period of time when the north and south poles of the Earth were identical to what we know. And this is another time when they were identical, and look how short this period of time is. This column represents periods of geologic time when our north and south poles were just the opposite of what we are right now. So what you see is that many times throughout Earth's history, this is why I'm showing you this slide, many times throughout Earth's history, Earth has gone through a 180-degree magnetic polar reversal. We see at least 14 times in the last 4.5 million years right here that we have had this polar reversal. The most recent that we're aware of through the geologic evidence appears to be between 11 and 13,000 years ago, right around in there. It coincides very well with Plato's accounts of the sinking of Atlantis and the biblical flood and some of the geologic evidence that we see in Egypt and the Middle East. Ancient texts, however, indicate that we may have experienced one of these polar reversals as recently as 3,500 to 3,600 years ago. 3,500 to 3,600 years ago. The traditions and the prophecies of many of the indigenous peoples seem to indicate that 3,500 years ago is not long enough to find in the geologic record. So we wouldn't expect to see it in a rock record. Where we do see evidence of this is in the ice records, in the Greenland ice caps, in the Antarctic ice caps, as we're taking measurements of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere caught in little bubbles. Something was happening 3,500 or 3,600 years ago. It also coincides very nicely to Zecharia Sitchin's work through his book, The 12th Planet, and many of the catastrophic events that he has indicated. So we may have experienced in our world a 180-degree magnetic reversal as little as 3,500 years ago. To the best of my knowledge, this has never happened with 6.5 billion people living on the planet. And it appears that you and I are living the precursive days, the precursive experiences to precisely this experience and more. And watch this. This is the magnetic fields. And what I ask you to remember from this is simply that as the magnetic fields drop, the faster they drop, the more they drop, and we appear to be moving toward a point where we have no magnetics, 0 point magnetics. 0 point magnetics. Now, at the same time, there is another parameter that is unfolding within our experience right now, and it is simply called base resonant frequency. It's a fundamental vibration. It's a fundamental heartbeat of the Earth. Every time the Earth pulses, every 1 second of our experience, when the Earth pulses electromagnetically, that pulse traditionally, historically, has been a certain number of beats per second, or cycles per second, or hertz, as the term is called. Traditionally, that number has been about 7.8. This number was first measured directly back in 1899 and 1900. And all the way through the early part of this century, through the 20s and the 30s, throughout World War I, World War II, all up in the 1950s, as late as the early 1980s, this number held constant, approximately 7.8 cycles per second. It is such a constant that actually in 1958 there was a meeting of a global meeting of technological countries that agreed from 1958 on not to publish the base resonant frequency of the Earth, not to publish that information, because it became a fundamental communications frequency and later was key in new weapon systems, electromagnetic weapon systems, based on this fundamental heartbeat of the Earth. That was the IGY, the International Geophysical Year. Well, we believed up until recently that this number 7.8 was a constant, that every second that we experience that Earth pulses a certain number of times. Well, something interesting began to happen in the, again, in the mid to late 1980s. What we see is this. There's 7.0, here's 8, 7.8, all the way through 1970s, 1980. In the mid to late 1980s, 86, 87, right around in there, that number began to increase mysteriously. And it went from 7.8 to 8 to 8.23 to 8.6. At the end of 1995, the number was validated at 8.6 cycles per second. In just a few years, it had been a constant throughout the time that we had been measuring this parameter. Now, in early 1996, researchers are reporting numbers as high as 9 cycles per second. While I have not seen that directly, those are the reports that are coming in. And I wouldn't be surprised because, as you can see on our little chart here, this green, the green line that we have drawn, this is the representation of this fundamental heartbeat, of the base resonant frequency, or the Schumann frequency of the Earth. This is frequency. And by the way, if you'd like to look this up in the open literature, this is under Schumann cavity resonance, S-C-H-U-M-A-N-N. If you do a word search on that at the library, you'll get about 250 references for a musician named Schumann. Go to the bottom of those, and if there are any references for the Schumann frequency, that's where you'll find them. So here's what we're seeing. Here again, time is moving in this direction, and our frequency increase is on this scale over here. And what we're seeing is this, that as we move forward in time, this vibration is increasing, and again, it's nonlinear. The more it increases, the faster it increases. Now, there's something interesting about the way that that frequency appears to be governed in our lives. There's a series of numbers. If you've studied the science of sacred geometry, I know you're very familiar with these numbers. If you've been to any of our workshops, you've seen them. It is called the Fibonacci, or Fibonacci, F-I-B-O-N-A-C-C-I. Fibonacci series of numbers. It is a sequence that begins like this. These are the first 12 elements of the sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 89, 144. Any element is derived by taking the sum of the previous two elements. 1 plus 1 are 2, 2 plus 1 are 3, 3 plus 2 are 5. This is a key, a fundamental code in governing the way that life expresses in our world. In your body, for example, if you're to measure the tip of any finger in your hand to that first joint, you will get a number, and so will the person sitting next to you. And if you take from that tip to the next joint, you'll get another number, and so will the person next to you, and the numbers will all be different. If you divide one number into the next, if you divide the big number into the little number, what you will get, even though the numbers are all different, the ratio between the two numbers will be the same. That happens with this series of numbers. You divide 8 into 5, or 3 into 2. And that ratio looks like this, 0.618. We call it the golden ratio, the golden mean. It appears to be such a powerful series of numbers, governing not only the proportions of the human body and the way our eyes are set in our head, and the heights of our ears, and where our nose is from the top of our lips, how large our lungs are, where the navel is in proportion to the rest of the body, how a finger knows to be a little finger instead of a thumb or an index finger. This series of numbers governs the branching pattern on trees, the root systems on plants, the way that water forks and branches as it moves downhill, the way that lightning branches, if you see finger lightning as it moves through the sky. Those dendritic patterns are all governed by this series of numbers, and it appears that this series of numbers also governs the fundamental heartbeat of our Earth. So, historically, Earth has hovered around 8 cycles per second, 7.8, just under 8 cycles per second. We are moving quickly now beyond that. Researchers now suspect that we're moving to the next element in this series that governs the heartbeat of the Earth, the lucky number 13, 13 cycles per second, right here. Now this is important. This is important to you. Here's the reason why. What I have just done is I've given you now 2 digitally measurable parameters of the Earth. These are the parameters now that dictate much of our experience in terms of cellular, genetic, and emotional response to what we call life. They are governed by this series of numbers. Now what we're seeing happening is this. With just this information now, you have enough information for yourself that you are able to develop a context within which all of the other things that we will do in these next few hours, all of the events of your life are unfolding within the context of these parameters. And let me show you why this is important to you. What we're seeing is this. The magnetics are falling quickly, apparently moving toward a time of 0 point magnetics. No magnetics on Earth. Frequency is increasing quickly, apparently moving toward or possibly reaching a threshold fundamental resonance of 13 cycles per second, 13 hertz. The day that that happens, the day that these 2 parameters become very, very close, possibly meeting, that point, that innocent-looking little point right there, that's the day that every belief system that I'm aware of, that I've ever studied, every religion, all of the sacred orders and the mystery schools and the sacred sects, the sect of the Rosicrucians, the sect of the Red Hand, the Amethystine orders, the Emerald orders, the Order of the Holy Grail, the Melchizedek orders, the Essene traditions, the Egyptian mystery schools, the Peruvian mystery schools. They are all, the Christian traditions, they are all based upon the ideas and the concepts of what you and I must do in our lives to prepare our bodies and our emotions to gracefully allow us to transition through this day in human history that the ancients called the shift of the ages. And I'll call it the shift from this point forward. That's what this point is all about. Some people call this the New Age. From this point forward, that is the time that they will reference as the New Age. Some people call this the Christing process, the Christing of Earth. There's so many terms out there that were meaningless, I thought I would just add one more to it and call it 0 point. 0 point experience. From the Hopi tradition, the Hopis say that we have lived in 5 previous worlds, this being the 5th that we're in right now, and that in each of these worlds there has come a time when our mind and our heart has become so separate, the connection, the relationship between our minds and our hearts have become so dissonant that there was no way to find the healing, and Earth goes through a time of purification to allow that healing process again. So from the Hopi perspective, we are now approaching the time of the 6th world of the Hopi. Other indigenous people say that we've lived in a dream for thousands of years, and that when we go to sleep at night, we live a dream within a dream, and that on this day, our dream changes. It's a new dream from that point forward. This point provides the context within which all the rest of the information will unfold as we go through these next few hours, this 0 point. Now, let's summarize what we've just done here, because we covered a lot of information in just a few seconds, a few moments of time. What we see is this. This is our Earth, a schematic, a cross-section schematic of the Earth, and the Earth rotates about an iron core. As Earth rotates, and remember, it's not only the Earth as we see it externally, it's all of the inner cores are rotating at the same time. As the Earth rotates around these cores, it generates magnetic fields. Okay? The faster the Earth rotates, the denser, the stronger the fields. The slower it rotates, the weaker the fields. Well, Earth is in the process right now. Our rotation is slowing down. Earth is slowing down. And as it does so, these fields become weaker and weaker until the point that the fields collapse to zero. Okay? Now, I have to tell you, as a geologist, an ex-geologist, this, to me, is an outrageous thing for me to say to you. When I first began to understand this, I said, there is no way. And this little voice in my head would say, way, and I'd say, no way, and it would say, way, and I'd say, no way, and it would say, way, because it has happened before. And now, as we're able to go back into the history, the written text and the non-written text, the geologic texts of our world, we see very clear evidence that this, in fact, has happened. That Earth, every once in a while, slows a rotation to a point where there is a rest period. There is no rotation. And it rests for a brief period of time and begins to increase the rotation again. And as it does so, it rotates in the opposite direction. And again, as a geologist, when I first began to understand that, I said, that's just outrageous. And the more I researched, the more I read, the more I went back and looked at the ancient texts, we see that it, in fact, has happened at least once that we're able to record, or we're able to discern in recorded history. When I was in school, I was taught that if Earth ever stopped rotating, there would be no gravity. And I get that question all the time. People say, well, what about gravity? If there's no rotation, does that mean everything flies off the planet? And I remember there were textbooks when I was in school that showed just that. They said if ever Earth would stop rotating, everybody would fly off. And they had these pictures of people that were, that were like this. Everybody was having a bad hair day, the day that the Earth stops rotating. And we now know that that is simply not the case, that Earth's gravity is not a function of the rotation. Without rotation at all, Earth still has gravity. When we send astronauts into space, and they are weightless in space, and we propel their craft in a rotational fashion so that they are able to stay on the sides of their capsule, that's not really gravity. What that is a centrifugal force that is throwing everything out to the sides of the craft so that they are able to simulate gravity. That is not true gravity. So what I'm saying to you is that whether Earth rotates or not is irrelevant in terms of the gravity of the Earth. We have records. If this were to happen in recorded human history, I would certainly expect that it would have been, someone would have noticed it and we would see it in our texts. And in fact, we do. We have at least one time, about 3,500 years ago, there's that number again. Now think about this. If Earth were ever to stop rotating on its axis, come to a rest, some portion of the Earth toward the sun would become very warm, and another portion would probably be very cool during the time that the rotation stopped. And that's precisely what we see in these texts. We see recorded in the Peruvian texts the long night that lasted almost 3 days, and at the same time, on the other side of the Earth, right here in the Middle East, what we see are biblical records of a long day that was over 20 hours long. The Hopi record a day where the sun rose twice in the same day. Now think about that. They call it the long day, where the sun rose once in the east and rose once in the west and set in the east, and later that day, the long day, 20 hours later, rose again in the east and set in the west, as it continues to do today. So it may be that we have very good records, if we have the wisdom to recognize them, of exactly this process happening at least once at some point in recorded Earth history. This time that we're talking about, the shift of the ages, you now have the parameters that are defining what this time means to us now. You and I probably are living the days, the precursive days, toward an event very similar to something like this. And the reality is that those inner cores will probably stop rotating long before the outer cores do, and you and I may not recognize this rotational shift quite the same way that we would expect to day in and day out in the normal sequence of our lives. And you'll understand, and I will explain that much better as we go through this information. This is such a powerful body of information to understand and to recognize what these parameters mean in our lives. But we're going to come back to our drawings here in just a few moments. What I'll ask you to do is to simply remember this process of decreasing magnetics and increasing frequency. Hold that thought just for a moment. I have another drawing here. This is what's called, it's a very simple phase diagram for you engineers. It's a phase diagram. I chose water, H2O, showing the different ways that water may express itself under different conditions. And you know these conditions, and that's why I chose this, so you could see these. Now this is temperature moving in this direction, increasing in this direction, and this is atmospheric pressure increasing in this direction right here. So what we can say is under certain temperatures and certain pressures, water within this dark line, water exists as a solid, as ice. Under a whole range of pressures right here, and under a narrower range of temperatures right here. Under other temperatures and pressures, water expresses as a liquid between this line and this line right here. And under other conditions, it expresses as a gas. Chemically, it's still water. It's H2O. Structurally, it's expressing very differently. It's going through what we call a phase transition or a change of state. And I've shown this to you because I believe it's a beautiful metaphor for precisely what you and I are experiencing on Earth right now. I believe that Earth is going through a phase transition. Instead of temperature and pressure, what we're dealing with are magnetics and frequency over time. As in our phase diagram, as temperature and pressure change, H2O continues to be H2O and crystallizes differently. As you and I and our Earth undergo a transition, a change of state of magnetics and frequency, we remain carbon-based beings. We remain in physical bodies, and our physical bodies are going through a change of state, a crystalline change of transition. That, I believe, is the essence of the experience that we are asking ourselves to assimilate at this time. That change of state, that transition, is the essence of what every belief system, every religion, and scientific doctrine that I'm aware of, that I've ever studied, is based upon. This is a beautiful image from the artist Alex Gray out of his book Sacred Mirrors. And what he's showing is this form of the human body. This body can be nothing more than the elements. It's superimposed upon a periodic table of elements behind us here. It's superimposed upon that table. The body can be nothing more than some combination of the elements, the very elements that we find in Earth. That's all these bodies are. They are different arrangements of all of these elements that we see right here. It's amazing when I take people on a sacred journey to Peru, for example, or to Egypt. And we go in Peru, we go to the Urubamba River, and we reach down and we pick up a handful of that sand. And it feels good. People like to feel that. And I say it should feel good to you because that's you. That sand, the elements and the minerals that you're holding in your hand, they are you, different ratios, different proportions and combinations. That's what you are. So all that we may be are the elements that we find here on our Earth. Our Earth is going through a phase transition. It's changing. We are asking ourselves to allow the gift of that transition as it unfolds within our bodies. This image, this particular image I chose, it's a beautiful image out of the first page of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Living, as it's now being called. And what you're seeing is in the center is an image of Buddha expressed as a being, and leading up to, these are all these concentric circles, are all of the experiences that a human must move through to achieve this Buddha state. Now the interesting thing is this, that Buddha is shown in the Buddha state, and look at this, all the experiences are given to us as vibratory codes, patterns of vibration that must be achieved before we reach this state. That'll be important in just a moment. I'm going to show you so that you may see with your own eyes the relationship between vibration and matter and the way that matter expresses within given parameters, within a given environment. Now, another reason I showed you this image is because In the traditional Tibetan scriptures, if I may use that term, there is a path that is outlined. It is a path of choice where somewhere in the life of a human, a mysterious force that we call the soul may have the opportunity to leave the physical body, as we've just defined it, and transition to another state of experience. We call that transition death. And the Tibetan book of the living and the dead go into tremendous details about coaching the soul through the transition of that death. So this is the Tibetan tradition. The Egyptian tradition shows something very similar. This is an image of the goddess Nut. Step back so you can see. This is the head of Nut. This is Nut's body. If you could see her feet and the rest of her body on the other side, what you would see is that the sun, the red dots of the sun, are birthed through the womb of Nut and go through the world of men, daylight, until they reach the other side, and Nut swallows the sun again, and we go into darkness, and the sun passes through her body and completes the cycle over and over again. Through this tradition, this is a code that was left in the mystery schools in the Egyptian temples. We live this cycle of light and dark in every breath that we inhale and exhale, in every day of our lives as those days pass through our lives. And they also make a distinction that at some point within the lifetime of each human, we will have the opportunity to make this transition where the life force or the soul leaves the body returns to those elements that it came from, just like you saw in Alex Gray's drawing, and the soul moves on into a new expression of itself, a very different experience. Okay? This is another image now, a very similar image in the Christian traditions, the Christian mystery schools, showing the same thing, showing the distinction between a dark world below, a lighter world in heaven, and a time in between those worlds, the time of our lives right now, as we walk in between these worlds. And the distinction is made between the time that we are here and to get to either here or here, the soul leaves the body. Okay, now I'm making that distinction because it is a path. The opportunity for the soul to leave the body and to transition into a higher form of experience is a path. It is not the only path. Okay? So I'm going to make a distinction between the Egyptian, the Tibetan, and the traditional Christian traditions, and the mystery schools are saying something very different. Between these traditions and the mystery schools, as we'll show them to you. So again, this is one of Alex Gray's beautiful drawings. This is a beautiful image of that moment where the soul transitions from the physical body. The physical body is left to deteriorate. It is the vibratory pattern of the soul, the will that holds these elements together, allowing this body to be what the body is. So, through those traditions, what we are conditioned to believe is at some point in our lives, the essence of our being transitions from the physical body into another form of experience, existence, and this body returns to the elements from which it was borrowed, back to the earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. That is a path. That is our conditioning in the Western world, and that is a choice. And now I'm going to draw a distinction and show you the choice and what that choice means in terms of all of the technical things that we have been discussing here in the last few minutes. Through the mystery schools, we are given another path, another opportunity for the body to express differently through life. These are, I just took some random passages out of ancient and sacred texts from the mystery schools, just to give you some idea of why context is so important. I'm going to read some of these to you. You may not be able to read them well on your own screen. I'll read them to you, and bear in mind that without context, what we're reading here makes very little sense to any of us. Our biblical texts say this. They say, "Lo, I tell you a mystery. In those days," they're talking about the shift of the ages, "in those days we shall not all sleep, we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye." Now what does that mean? What does that mean, that change? Without context, it doesn't make much sense at all. The emerald tablets of Thoth A fascinating body of information. It's not channeled. It was actually written and recorded approximately 13,000 years ago. It's actually pre-Egyptian texts. This book, the Emerald Tablets, became, and it remains today, essentially the Bible of the Freemasons, the Masonic traditions, the homeopathic sciences, as above, so below, and like treats like. Those all come from this text of Thoth, the Egyptian master in the Emerald Tablets. And look what Thoth says. He says that man is human, not making a distinction between male and female, but the form of man is in the process of changing to forms of light that are not of this world. Now, we hear that all the time today from all the channel material and all the books and the workshops that are out there. 13,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, this is a pretty outrageous thing for anyone to say, that we were changing into forms of light. Now, two passages from the Book of Mormon. These are a couple of my favorites. It says that in those days, in the days of the shift of the ages, that ye shall never, that ye shall never endure the pains of death when I come in my glory, speaking of the universal reference beings, ye shall be changed in the twinkling of an eye from mortality to immortality. And it goes on to say that it is in our bodies that we will see our Creator, in our bodies that we'll see God. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with religion, although it is taken from what may be considered religious texts. This is ancient information of a phase transition within the human body, information that was left to us that does not make a lot of sense in the past without the context within which to frame this transition. The ancient Essenes, I identify very closely with the traditions of the Essenes. The Essenes were a sect of individuals who separated themselves from others of their time so that they could live their traditions and their belief systems in the way that they felt was appropriate. And in the Essene traditions, we're given a much different story in terms of our history, our purpose, our lives in this world, and this phase transition that Earth and our bodies are going through in this moment. We'll give that transition a name in just a few minutes. So through the Essene traditions, much of this information, many of these traditions are found in the scrolls that were found in the Qumran area around the Dead Sea. They became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're certainly not limited to the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see the Essene traditions throughout the Tibetan texts, throughout the Egyptian texts, in the Ethiopian traditions, in the Armenian traditions. They are scattered throughout our ancient texts if we have the wisdom to see them. And there is a universal thread that runs through those traditions. Okay. In the traditions of the Essenes, through the Dead Sea Scrolls and many of the other texts, what we find is this. We find that all of the biblical books in the Old Testament are verified in those Dead Sea Scrolls, and more that we have not seen. And what it appears has happened, and what we know from our history, is that somewhere around the year 325 A.D., somewhere right around in there, what we call our biblical text was revamped. Many books were deleted. Those that were left were compressed into a smaller form. Some of the books that were taken out of our text remain in the Dead Sea Scrolls, remain in the Nag Hammadi scrolls, the Nag Hammadi texts, also discovered in 1947, in the Tibetan texts. Look at what some of these books are all about. This is fascinating information. The Gospel of the Birth of Mary. This is a beautiful body of information that details the life of Mary. Mary's mother, for example, 81 years old when she gave birth to the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. And Mary's mother had been barren for those 81 years, had never given birth to anyone else. Mary was 14 years old when she married her husband Joseph. All that information. The Essene mystery schools played a key role in these women's lives as they were Essene initiates. The books of visions of the prophets, the letters of Herod and Pilate. This is an especially interesting book. Between these two men, the letters were written immediately following the crucifixion of Christ. And the letters go something like this. Pilate wrote a letter to Herod, who was the king at that time, and said, I think we just made a mistake. in this execution. And Herod wrote a letter back to Pilate and said, what do you mean we? Why do you say we made a mistake? You were the one that made that choice. And Pilate writes back and says, well, I didn't really want him killed. It was the people of the village, and it goes on from there. It gives us a very different view of the life of the Essenes, of the thought processes surrounding this execution. The secrets of the Book of Enoch. This is one of the reasons I put this in here. The Book of Enoch is a beautiful book of mysteries. The prophet Enoch, taken from his time ahead of our time to see what our world would be like, taken back to his time, recording that information and passing it down to us so that we would have a map of what this time in our history looks like. The Book of Enoch, portions of it are so detailed they actually become a little boring as we go through this, as they give day-by-day accounts of the change of the cycles of the moon and change of the cycles of the sun and the magnetic fields, the earth tilting on its axis is actually what it says in this Book of Enoch. Those are books that we no longer have in our biblical text and that have a tremendous bearing on this time in history and this time in our lives. Well, through these Essene traditions, we are given insights into the life of a man, a reverence being, and I say that very intentionally, a man who came as a human to live among humans, to learn what humans had learned. A man we now know is Jesus of Nazareth. And as I'm saying this, what I'll say to you now on the camera, it may be no accident that this is being videoed on this day. This is Easter Sunday, 1996. And everyone here in the studio now is smiling because we're actually filming this on Easter Sunday. Maybe no accident that is happening. That this initiate, Jesus of Nazareth, lived the life that you and I have learned to live. He learned to trade. He lived, archaeological records now are showing that the little village that he lived in wasn't so little at all. It was a booming metropolis of about 40,000 people. He learned of commerce. He had to do everything that you are learning to do in your life. He had to master the emotions of his life in order to proceed through the choices that he was making in his life. I particularly love this image of Jesus as an initiate, as a student learning. This is again from Cheryl Yonbrock Rose. The title of this image is Christ Anchoring the Celtic Ray in England. This is one of the sacred sites in England. So through the Essene traditions, what we are shown, what we are told is this, that at least once, one man, Jesus of Nazareth, remembered the true nature of his being, the nature of compassion, and we'll define that compassion genetically in just a few moments. He remembered that compassion, he became that compassion in his life, and in doing so, allowed a biochemical shift in his body, a genetic change, a reordering of genetic coding. You'll see all of this very, very clearly with schematics and drawings in just a few moments. And in that reordering, he allowed himself the opportunity to live a phase transition, to live a change of state. And today, we call that change of state resurrection. Now, resurrection has such a powerful connotation. Whenever we say the word resurrection, for so many people, it conjures up images of religious processes. Resurrection has nothing to do with religion, although religions were built surrounding the concepts of what this alchemy is all about. This is the union, the holy union, the marriage between spirit and the elements of this earth, as you saw in Alex Gray's body. So what we're experiencing is this. Our earth is going through a phase transition, low magnetics, higher frequencies. We live within the fields of those transitions. We live upon the earth. Every cell in our body is attempting to maintain a resonance, to stay tuned, to stay with those magnetics, to stay with those frequencies, allowing us to also transition with the earth into this higher expression, this higher form of energy that is being expressed through the 7.8 and 8.6 and 9 cycle per second energy. Resurrection is a path. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, anchored this wisdom. He lived among us and anchored this wisdom in our conscious matrix. He became the living bridge for us 2,000 years later, so that we would have access to his wisdom as we actually live the transition, as Earth actually carries us through the transition. Now, there's a lot of controversy as to whether or not this man actually ever existed, lived or not. Some of the controversy centers around this relic that is known as the Shroud of Turin. Now, this particular shroud, this is a linen shroud that was wrapped, it's said to have been wrapped around the body of Christ following the crucifixion, and is this shroud that was left in the burial chamber after his body disappeared following his resurrection. A lot of controversy surrounding this. I'll say right now, we will never know for sure who was in this shroud. We don't know certainly who it was. In the past, through the methods of dating, carbon-14 dating and things like that, it has taken so much of a sample in order to establish the dates that the original artifact has been destroyed. It would have taken a square foot of this linen being destroyed to date this according to carbon-14 traditions. Well, in 1978, Los Alamos National Labs in north central New Mexico was able to obtain this shroud for a period of time, and they ran some new analyses on it without destroying the fibers, and here's what they found. What they discovered was this. The controversy has been whether or not this image, what is this image that we're seeing on this 2,000-year-old shroud? Some people say it's painted, some people say it's body oils from the body that was within the shroud. What Los Alamos National Labs is saying, and this team was headed up by a gentleman named Ray Rogers in 1978. They're saying this, that the weaving and the linen type of this shroud are authentic to the date about 2,000 years ago that we would expect to see from that time in history. So it probably is about 2,000 years old. That the image that you're seeing on here appears to be a photographic negative on this linen. And here's why they say that. Because when we photograph the negative of the shroud, we end up with a positive of the image. So it may be that this shroud essentially is a photographic negative over 2,000 years old. When we photograph that now, we have a very good positive image of whoever this man was. Now, what the report says, it says that this image was not painted, it's not body oils, it's not some charcoal rubbing or anything like that. That the fibers of the linen are actually scorched from, they were scorched from within the shroud, whatever the shroud was covering, the body. The fibers were scorched from within by a high, rapid, intense heat source of biochemical origin unknown to us at this time. That's actually what the report says. We call that resurrection. A rapid influx of tremendous amounts of life force or chi or prana intentionally distributed to every cell in the body, allowing those cells a higher vibratory expression of themselves. So we'll never know precisely who this man is. The damage on the man's wrists, around his head, and in his side do match the damage that is given to us, that was given to the body of Christ during the crucifixion process. Again, we'll never know for certain precisely who this man was. The reason I have this slide here is because I'm showing you at least once in our history we may have been given the opportunity to see, to witness the demonstration of a change of state, a phase transition that we call resurrection. In the Essene traditions, then what we see is at least once this reference being, a reference being that we know as Jesus of Nazareth, the gift that that reference being left for us then was the gift of the wisdom to allow this phase transition, this change of state, this process that we call resurrection within our bodies. Compassion in the Essene traditions. Compassion is a knowable, livable science. And again, this is the image that to me conjures up the sense of compassion. Cheryl's image of Archangel Michael in prayer over the Middle East in the Gulf War. It is through compassion, the science of compassion, And you and I will work together to arrive at this understanding through this video. Through the science of compassion, that emotions, as they were allowed to express fully in the body, shift genetic patterns, genetic codes within the body, allowing the body the tuning, allowing the body to ride in the transition with the earth. As the earth goes through her changes, our bodies are being asked to go through theirs. The image that you're seeing is a frozen image, a still image of a dynamic system from a science that we call the science of cymatics, the relationship between sound and form. In this pattern, you'll begin to understand now why the magnetics of the earth falling and the frequency increasing, why they're so important to you. A gentleman named Hans Jenny, who's no longer with us, developed this science of cymatics back in the late 1940s. And essentially what he said is this: for every vibration, whether it's an audible sound or an inaudible frequency, for every audible or every pattern of vibration, as it's projected into some media, some form of matter, there will be a predictable, repeatable, consistent pattern. And when the vibration changes, that pattern changes. And when the vibration goes back to what it was, the pattern goes back to what it was. Well, what I'd like to do now is show you a series of cymatic images so that you can see this with your own eyes, so that you can feel this with your body. There's a body resonance that I'd like for you to have before we move forward with this discussion. So what you will see now is a series of cymatic images, and I'll let you watch them, listen to them, and then we'll come back and discuss those. The image you're seeing is a cymatics image. It's the result of a vibration being projected into a media. And what you'll notice is that the higher the frequencies of the vibration that you're seeing, the more complex the patterns. As you watch carefully, you'll see these patterns will become more and more complex, resulting or being the result of increasingly complex and higher frequencies. If you listen carefully, you can just barely hear these sounds. See how much more complex this image is, the result of the higher frequency. This is being narrated by a gentleman named Dr. Peter Guy Manners. And you'll hear Dr. Manners' voice throughout as we see these different cymatics images. These sounds are being projected into a media of lycopodium. It is the spore of the mugwort plant. And it's the lycopodium, the particles of lycopodium that you're seeing in motion throughout. Now in this particular image, watch what happens as the frequencies increase. If you were to look at a single particle, it would look like it was in chaos, and when you back off and look at the overall particles, you see there is a very high order.
Transition to a mobile flowing phase. And back again to the figure. The sonorous figures represent stationary waves. But now we can also observe moving waves. Here, the sand is flowing the current.
Now look at the rotational effect that you're seeing here. As the frequencies increase, the system responds through rotation. And you'll see this very well in the next few seconds.
When the wavelengths are short, these currents produce a rotary effect. Areas become defined in which the particles are actually rotating.
Now look at this. If you did not know any better, you may believe that you are looking at an image of interstellar space through a telescope. These look like galaxies. What is it that drives the rotational effect in our galaxies? What is it that drives the rotation of the planets? What is it that drives and impacts the rotation of Earth?
we produce two
Now, what we've seen up until now are single signals, single frequencies projected in the matter. What you're seeing here now are interference patterns of two or more frequencies resulting in a pulse. The pulse of the human heart, the pulse that drives the blood through the veins in your bodies. What is your heart responding to? Where does that pulse come from? These systems look almost alive. Simply the result of vibration. When the vibration stops, the patterns stop.